I know those of you that have been following along closely can tell me that the Cold War is really redefining virtually every element of American life. It's going to play a part in our economic development in the post-war period. It's going to take a toll on our political system, and you're also going to see it play itself out in American social relations as well. Now, when I say that, one of the things that I mean is that this early stage of the Cold War is going to give rise to what historians refer to as a second Red Scare. Why a second Red Scare? Well, simply put, we had had a Red Scare in this country before, and it occurred in 1919. If you recall, there was an anti-immigrant, anti-radical sentiment that had really begun to crystallize in the aftermath of World War One, and a lot of this really manifests itself when it comes to not only a fear of radicalism, especially communism, you also see it manifest itself in an expansion of government to really kind of shore up what might loosely be called security. Okay? The post-World War II period is really not that much different in that respect. There was this fear of communism and communistic ambitions for what the post-war world would look like. But the twist in all of this is going to be that by now, unlike 1919, we've got nuclear warheads on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. We have the ability as human beings to destroy ourselves, the world in the process. And so, in the aftermath of the Soviet Union accessing the nuclear bomb, the stakes are raised monumentally. Okay? And so, one of the things that this is going to do, and we've talked about this in a roundabout way, is it's going to give rise to this idea that somehow, some way, there had to be American-born communists that had sold us out. They had traded secrets to the enemy for their own selfish purposes, and that was the reason that the Soviets were able to get the bomb so quickly. Now, even as late as when I went to college, my instructors, my professors would have you know that this was nothing more than a lot of opportunistic politicians that were trying to gin up votes. They were trying to play upon the fears that Americans had when it comes to this Cold War and nuclear annihilation, and there were votes in anti-communism. And then, especially in the late 1990s, the former Soviet Union's archives began opening up to Western scholars, and what we found out was there was some good old-fashioned Soviet espionage that were going on. The guy that you're looking at there on the PowerPoint slide, the guy with the rimmed glasses, that's a British scientist, technically German, but removed to Great Britain, Klaus Fuchs. And in the post-war period, Fuchs is going to admit to British authorities that he actually did, in fact, give nuclear secrets to the Soviet Union. Maybe even more concerning is the guy with the microphones in front of him, right next to him. That's Alger Hiss. And what Hiss is doing is he's testifying in front of a House committee investigating individuals that may be involved with communists as spies or otherwise, but also happen to be employed in the federal government. In the case of Alger Hiss, he's a very high-ranking official within the State Department. This is very, very concerning considering he has access to very, shall we say, delicate information that very well may be used against us. Now, the big to-do when it comes to Alger Hiss is one of the lead investigators, a newly elected congressman from California, a guy by the name of Richard Nixon. Not going to be the last time that we talk about that name. He is able to uncover an idea that Hiss is lying. He's lying under oath, and that is a very serious offense. But maybe even more importantly, Alger Hiss, who was charged with being a Soviet spy, a charge that he adamantly denied. If Richard Nixon was able to uncover the fact that he was lying about something else, something that had nothing to do with espionage, what else is he lying about, right? It was about creating that shadow of a doubt. And of course, there's opportunity here. There was votes to be had in anti-communism, but this is adding fuel to the fire in the sense that we have found the enemy and he is us. But the gold standard of Soviet espionage in the post-war period is that couple that you see at the bottom of the screen there, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. Julius Rosenberg was a member of the Communist Party. He was relatively open about that, really didn't care who knew it. And in the early 1950s, he's accused of handing over nuclear secrets to the Soviet Union. That is a charge that was in fact true, and the government did in fact have dirt on him. It was a government anti-communist, anti-espionage program that was known as COINTELPRO. And the problem that COINTELPRO is going to have when this inevitably goes to court is they can't really out Julius Rosenberg, because to produce the dirt that they have on him would essentially be to blow their cover. And as you might imagine, they've got many different irons in the fire when it comes to prosecuting communists. So what the government is going to decide to do when it comes to Julius Rosenberg is lean on his wife, who may or may not have been a member of the Communist Party. But considering for a second that Julius is conducting some party business in their own living room, certainly she had a very good idea in terms of exactly what he was up to. Okay? The idea here was the government would pressure Julius Rosenberg by saying that they actually had dirt on Ethel as well, trying to get him to crack and confess to the whole thing, save his wife by saying she didn't have anything to do with it, right? But the simple fact of the matter is the Rosenbergs are being tried for treason. Now, Julius never cracks. He doesn't do what the government wants him to do. And in the end, we end up convicting both of them of espionage, treason really. And a couple of years later, even though there's an international outcry to spare their lives, we execute both Rosenbergs for their role in Soviet espionage. Now, we've seen this to some extent in the past, the Sacco and Vanzetti trial. Certainly that was a product of the anti-radicalism of the earlier part of the 20th century. But these are American-born citizens, okay? Sacco and Vanzetti, although that case was tragic, they had never applied for American citizenship. We just upped the ante, and in a very bad way. In the years that are going to come, we are going to move in the direction of outlawing the Communist Party. Now, full disclosure, I don't think that the Communist Party ever really had an awful lot of political capital to offer to the American people, okay? True, they did support issues involving things like civil rights, and they supported the drive for unionization in the 1930s and early 1940s. But when it comes to a political entity that could really deliver for the American people, I don't think that you would have found too many Americans that would have seen or viewed their message as all that positive. Okay? What I'm trying to say is they were very unpopular. But in a democracy, you've got to make room for organizations and opinions that, even in the context of the time, might be very, very unpopular. Because when you go down the road of outlawing political organizations, you ultimately really run the risk of having democracy die right in front of your eyes. We're in a very vulnerable time period here. And what we're going to see is Harry Truman, President Truman, implement an executive order, 9835, that will institute a loyalty review board for all federal employees. I mean, everybody from the Secretary of State right down to the guy that carries your mail to your house, your postman, they have to go in front of one of these government committees and swear their loyalty to the United States. They have to answer all kinds of probing questions. It might not seem like that big of a deal to you, but as I had mentioned before, this really can turn into a slippery slope pretty quickly here. In 1950, the Internal Security Act required all card-carrying members of the Communist Party to register with the government. That's important because you're not asking Republicans to do so or Democrats to do so. Um, the other reason that it's important is a few years later, 1954, we get the Communist Control Act, which says if there's ever an emergency, war breaks out with the Soviet Union, economic collapse, President Eisenhower can't find his slippers in the morning, any kind of situation that you want to call a national emergency, communists could be rounded up and thrown into concentration camps. And now, because we've got them registered with the government in this database, we know exactly where to go to find them. But really, the crown jewel of anti-communism when it comes to investigatory committees would be the House Committee on Un-American Activities, or more succinctly, HUAC. Without getting into the long, detailed history of this House Committee, just understand that it emerged in the late 1930s to keep an eye on both extremes of the political spectrum, the extreme right as well as the extreme left. But let's be honest about something else. In the post-World War II era, it is the extreme left that is seen as the new enemies of democracy. It's communists that present the greatest threat here. And so what HUAC would do is they would bring individuals in front of them. These are members of the House of Representatives, and they would ask them point blank, are you now or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? Now, for those of you that have studied law or even taken earlier American history, you might be able to tell me that the Fifth Amendment of the Bill of Rights protects you from bearing witness against yourself in a court of law. You can respectfully refuse to answer that question based on the idea that it may incriminate you. May not, but you have that right, that protection of the Constitution. The problem here in the context of this second Red Scare is refusal to answer the question was just about as good as admitting guilt. Your silence was seen as an admission of guilt. Even individuals that had maybe once upon a time had some loose affiliation with the Communist Party, but had long since given up on that organization, they were cleared, their names were exonerated, but when they went back to their private lives, whether that was their professional lives at work or maybe it's just their social lives in their social network, ostracized, in some cases careers were stunted, in worse cases they were destroyed. And these are the victims of the second Red Scare. Now, I think it probably is worth noting that what's happening in the Soviet Union, what Joseph Stalin is doing to consolidate his power and purge people that might be his own political enemies, is infinitely, infinitely worse than what's going on in the United States. Meaning, HUAC is a blip on the radar compared to what the Russians are doing. But let's be honest about something else. Russia shouldn't be the benchmark to American democracy. We're better than that. We're capable of better. Right? Anyway, dangerous dark road that we're tending to go down here, and it's going to get even more intense. I don't want to spend an enormous amount of time on this, but in 1948, the 12 leading members of the Communist Party, they were all rounded up. They were put on trial for violation of what was known as the Smith Act. In 1940, Congress passes this law known as the Smith Act, which makes belonging to an organization whose stated goal is the overthrow of the government, it makes it an illegal organization, and if you belong to that, you are essentially breaking the law. Well, if you think back to the beginnings of the Communist Party, that is their stated goal. In 1948, in a Supreme Court ruling that comes to be known as Dennis versus the United States, all of these individuals are found guilty and ultimately sentenced to up to 5 years in prison. Now, the decision involving Dennis is very, very delicate, and primarily because the prosecuting attorneys never really had any smoking gun evidence that these individuals were actively working to overthrow the government, that there were things that were going on, that there was plans that were being hatched to overthrow the government. Basically, what the government presented was ideas, whether written or oral, in the idea of theories, right? And so essentially what went on trial in 1948 was the First Amendment. Again, I'm not saying that this is popular free speech, but at the end of the day, it's free speech. It's the same reason why colleges and universities allow groups like the Ku Klux Klan, groups like the Nazi Party. They're not very popular either, but they're allowed to speak because we have this issue known as free speech, protected under the First Amendment. And the thought was democracies like the United States are strong enough to accommodate free speech that happens to be very, very unpopular. And in the 1940s and early 1950s, that's clearly being called into question. Okay? The bottom line is the Red Scare is going to invade virtually every element of American life. You will see universities that will begin to purge some of their faculty, some of those professors that were active in one campaign or another, which may or may not have been organized by radicals like the socialists or the communists in the midst of the Great Depression. They'll be fired, they'll be investigated, their careers will be destroyed. You see the Red Scare moving into Hollywood. The idea being there were communists that were actively involved in that industry, and they were working to provide subliminal messages to American moviegoers. I bet you know the individual at the bottom of that screen there, the guy that's got the microphones in front of him. That's Ronald Reagan. And if you know anything about Ronald Reagan, you'll know that he was not only an actor, but he was also the president of the Screen Actors Guild, a union in Hollywood. And what he's saying, he's not in trouble, don't worry about him. He's telling HUAC, I don't even need to think about it. I give you 10 names right now. Writers, producers, cameramen, the guy that sweeps up after the set has closed, all card-carrying members of the Communist Party. Again, we're upping the ante when it comes to the fear factor. But the face of anti-communism in the 1950s, at least the early 1950s, is none other than that of Joseph McCarthy. Okay? Joseph McCarthy was elected to Congress, and one of the things that he quickly looked for in the late 40s, early 50s was a thing. What he found was communism. And what you're seeing him do right there is wave a document in front of the American people at this speech that he was involved with, Wheeling, West Virginia. And what he's saying is he has found numerous instances of card-carrying, dues-paying members of the Communist Party that work in the highest levels of American government. Now, ultimately, what McCarthy is going to do is use the mantra of anti-communism, the fear of communism, to further his own political career. He's going to go on these communist witch hunts, and in the process, he's going to gain an enormous amount of notoriety. In certain circles, he's going to garner an awful lot of praise, a lot of admiration. And in the process, what's going to end up happening is there will be a lot of people that will simply capitulate. What McCarthy is doing with anti-communism is he's using it as a bullying factor. If you don't want to move in the direction that I want to move, one policy or the other, the only reason that can explain any of that is because you yourself are a communist. If you oppose my methods, my bringing people in front of senatorial committees and investigating them and investigating their actions, the only reason that you could question me on this issue is because you yourself are a card-carrying member of the Communist Party. What he's doing is he's using anti-communism to really intimidate people when it comes to standing up against the direction that he's trying to take this country. The problem that McCarthy's going to have, I mean, this is great for votes and notoriety, but it's got a shelf life to it, right? There's only so many institutions and individuals that you can investigate. Eventually, you're going to run out. And by 1954, McCarthy was beginning to run out of people to investigate. And he really began to move into the realm of the U.S. military. It is 1954, and the hearings that McCarthy would conduct, especially when it involved the U.S. Army, they were televised. And he begins to go after this U.S. Army dentist. And he wasn't even a communist, the dentist. He just wanted the dentist to kind of renounce his father, who was rumored to have affiliations with the Communist Party. Well, this dentist just simply refused to do that on national television with the entire country looking on. And what McCarthy did is pushed him around. He bullied him for the better part of 2 weeks. Again, all of this is televised, and Americans got a very close personal look at the tactics, the ugly, nasty tactics that Joseph McCarthy used to really capitalize on the issue of anti-communism. One individual that really was put off by all of this was America's newsman, the guy that you're looking at the bottom of the screen there, CBS news anchor Ed Murrow. Ed Murrow is going to challenge Joseph McCarthy directly on one edition of the CBS Evening News. Now, you have to understand that it took a lot of gumption, a lot of gall, a lot of courage to do this, considering not only was McCarthy a very powerful senator, but the accusation of being a communist was also a very powerful weapon when it comes to getting people to capitulate. So Murrow's really going out on a limb here. He's risking his career, he's risking his reputation, he's risking certain friendships in various circles that he runs with. But ultimately, what he'll do on this news hour is expose the dangers of McCarthyism, the dangers of using political intimidation, and the most vile of methods to do the intimidating as to how it might be so problematic for American democracy. Ultimately, what Murrow's account comes down to, you can't export democracy abroad. You can't even protect democracy abroad in Africa, in the Middle East, in the Far East. You can't do it when you abandon democratic principles here at home. He says, listen, nobody's saying don't investigate. But there's a very fine line between investigation and persecution, and the senator from Wisconsin has crossed that line again and again and again. And he says, to that end, it's not really even his fault. He was merely trying to exploit the fears of a nation at a time for his own personal gain. Not good, but the fault lies with the American people that more or less allowed him to get away with doing this, that took its eye off the ball when it comes to its democratic principles, especially those involved in the First Amendment. Now, again, this was a very risky move for Ed Murrow to make. But all throughout that broadcast, he extended a very welcome invitation to Joseph McCarthy. If you think that I have done disservice to your words, deeds, or actions, please, you will always have a seat on this program. I will gladly allow you to defend yourself. You can correct me in any way you feel necessary, and you can defend yourself to the American people. McCarthy never took him up on that invitation. Instead, what he did, as you might guess, is he called Ed Murrow a communist. Now, I know that it was a pretty big risk, Murrow doing what he did, but you have to understand the ridiculousness of calling Ed Murrow a communist. I mean, maybe it wasn't the most popular thing to do, but the equivalent, the only thing that I can think of that might make some sense to you, it would be the equivalent of calling someone like Oprah Winfrey a terrorist. I mean, nobody, anywhere, no matter how inclined they might be to fear communism, nobody was really going to take that serious. So the combination of Americans viewing Joseph McCarthy's methods through this Army dentist trial, televised, right, and Ed Murrow's public takedown of Joe McCarthy ultimately ended in the unceremonious defeat of McCarthyism, broadly defined. It's around about this time, 1954, that the Senate voted to censure Joseph McCarthy, which is a very fancy way of saying sit down and shut up, you've lost all levels of credibility. And in the end, this pretty much put an end to his career. He was a heavy drinker, he died a few short years later, and nobody really seemed to notice. But I think in many ways, guys, the damage had largely been done. In the time that we have remaining, I want to talk a bit about the legacy of McCarthyism. on the most basic levels, one thing that McCarthyism did is it led to a silencing of dissent, right? All dissent means is to disagree. And in a democracy, sometimes some of the most patriotic things that you can do is dissent. I do not agree for this reason, that reason, and that reason. Dissent is not disloyal, and you should never confuse the two, right? Simply because you disagree does not make you an unpatriotic American. It also quieted debate. Debate is the lifeblood of a democracy. And if everybody's running around worried about being labeled a communist or a traitor or anything, you're not going to have the necessary debates you need to move the country forward. It's going to pose a direct threat to academic freedom, free speech. A lot of times, what you're going to see in the 1950s is, especially in disciplines like history, you're going to see the very vanilla version of history. You're not going to talk about controversial individuals. You're not going to talk about controversial topics. You're going to stick to the script when it comes to, American history. And you might even say the same thing for things like political science, sociology, economics, okay? It will curb the growth of the labor movement. Reason why is, as we've discussed in this class before, many people that were instrumental in those great union drives of the 30s and early 40s, they happen to be members of the Communist Party. What you're going to see the unions do is more or less throw those people out to safeguard their own longevity in American life. In order to protect the union, we had to get rid of all of these communists that helped to build the union, okay? It also created many controversies with respect to government agencies. The idea being that a big government takeover, probably the best example we can point to would be healthcare, would lead to socialized medicine. Essentially, it was a road to communism. Anytime you begin to think about a government program in an institution like healthcare, you are opening a great big massive door to the institution of communism. But more than anything else, and if you don't get anything else in your notes other than this, I want you to make the connection that one of the things that McCarthyism led to was a culture of conformity. Do not be different. Do not stand out. Go along with the crowd. Conform to the ideals of middle class America. Conform to this idea that you wanted to grow up, graduate through high school so you can go to college so that you can get a job and marry your college or high school sweetheart, have kids, buy the white picket fence house in the suburbs, right? That's what I mean when it comes to this culture of conformity. Because to not want that would be considered pretty odd, pretty different. And in a time period when anything that's considered different is deeply, deeply suspicious, there's a very good chance that you might end up with the label of communist. And as I've pointed out in this lecture again and again, there's very few ways that you come back from a charge like that. Okay. In any case, that's what I mean when it comes to McCarthyism and the contribution it makes to the culture of conformity. Maybe end with this thought. I'm sure many of you have heard the expression, get them while they're young. This whole culture of conformity and this whole culture of anti-communism might strike you as a bit strange. You have to understand that an entire generation of young Americans had been brought up in this context that we could be blown to smithereens basically any given moment. And it only got more and more and more intense, as you're going to find out, as the post-war period continued to evolve. So one of the things that we felt we needed to do was we needed to make sure that everybody was ready, but especially our young people. They needed to know what to do in the case of a nuclear attack. The same way that you need to know what to do if there's ever a fire that breaks out or you've got severe weather, you need to know where to go and what to do, and more than anything else, don't panic. Enter into our conversation a State Department cartoon that came to be known as Bert the Turtle. And what Bert the Turtle told millions and millions of school-age Americans to do was to duck and cover. Okay? What you're supposed to do if there was this flash or if there was this warning to get inside, you're supposed to duck, you're supposed to cover, and you're supposed to prepare for this nuclear attack. It was important that you knew what to do so that if the time, and the cartoon made it almost seem inevitable that this attack was going to come, you could respond with the necessary calmness and purposefulness that it would take to get through an ordeal like this. But when you're practicing those air raid drills, you don't question this connection that a lot of anti-communists are making between communism and people that tend to be a little bit different. We're talking about a horribly repressive time when it comes to sexual orientation. I mean, heterosexual sexuality was not something that was discussed all that openly, right? Let alone same-sex couples. We're talking about a time period where people didn't eat pizza. People didn't eat what you and I might think of as regular everyday food, right? They ate pot roast. They ate turkey. They ate things that were all American sorts of meals because to eat something like pizza or spaghetti, that was too ethnic, that was too different, and in a time period when being labeled different was dangerous, you lead to this culture involving xenophobia, a fear of foreigners, because it might have that connection, that tag anyway, of communistic. So as you can see, what the Cold War is doing is it's permeating every element of American life. Okay, you certainly see it really evolve American culture, and not in so good of a way. The next time we meet, we're going to see how this plays a role in the American economy. And of course, it's got good connotations to this. The post-war period is pretty good when it comes to economic times. But as Dwight Eisenhower would say, there's a risk involved in all of this, a risk that the president would later label um, the um, that's where I want to leave it.